Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Crafting and Crime Daily. This is the show where I usually recap live trials, but it's tomorrow's Thanksgiving, so no trials this week. Now, part one of the story of Timothy Evans, I told you about yesterday. Today is part two. We're going to talk about what was found in the kitchen of the first story of the three-story flat where Timothy lived with his wife Beryl and daughter Geraldine on the top floor. Now, on that bottom floor, John Christie and his wife Ethel lived there. They had moved in 1938. They were a middle-aged couple, and they were the star witnesses at the trial of Timothy Evans for the murder of his wife and daughter. So after that trial ended and Timothy was executed, a Jamaican person took over, bought the place, and he was having the first floor, the first story flat renovated after John and his wife Ethel moved out 3 years later, 1953. So we're in March of 1953. 4 days after John and Ethel move out, and a construction worker, he's in the kitchen. He's trying to find studs so he can place a couple outlets in the kitchen, and he realizes there's something hollow behind this wall. So he removes the wallpaper, and there's a little alcove there. So he peers in and is just in shock at what he finds. So he leaves the home, goes out to get to a payphone, calls the police, and they arrive. When they see what the construction worker saw, they peel away the rest of the wallpaper. What did this construction worker see? Well, there was a young woman, the body of a young woman with her hands bound together, deceased behind that wall. So once they peel the wallpaper away, they find a door. They open the door, and it's kind of like a kitchen cupboard type, not very much space at all, but within that space was the body of a second female victim, young, with her ankles bound together. Behind her was another blanket. They uncovered the blanket, they removed the blanket, and it's a third victim, the body of a young woman with her ankles bound. So now they're like, oh boy, we got a serial killer on our hands. Where is John Christie? Well, so they're searching the rest of the apartment for secret doors and things. Well, they notice that the floorboards in the living room are loose. So they remove those floorboards, and underneath is some loose dirt, and they proceed to excavate the dirt, and they find the body of a fourth victim, a middle-aged woman. Now, her hands and feet were not bound, but she was deceased in this dirt underneath the floorboard. So these bodies are sent to the coroner's office, and his determination was that they were all strangled. The three women in the cupboards, in the kitchen, the alcoves, they were sexually assaulted as well. And the second victim that was found was 6 months pregnant. Some of these bodies of the four women, their skin had like a pinkish color to it, which the coroner said was likely the result of carbon monoxide poisoning. So that was added into the mix of findings. Now, within these apartments, there was gas for heat during the winter, and at the time, the gas contained a small percentage of carbon monoxide. But we'll learn later on that John Christie confesses to having made this device where he could deliver gas to these women that in the form of carbon monoxide. He would hook up this device to the gas from the apartment, give it to them. They would inhale it till they go unconscious. Then he would sexually assault them and strangle them and hide their bodies. So who is this John Christie? Now, we talked a little bit about him in yesterday's episode because he was the star witness in the trial of Timothy Evans. Timothy's story, he had several stories, but it mainly centered around, hey, I didn't do this. John Christie did this. Well, nobody was buying at the time because John Christie claimed he had been home because of a back injury, was suffering from back pain and some severe gastritis. So, how could he have done these murders and hidden the bodies? So, after they find these four bodies in the house, they decide, John and Ethel had negotiated with this Jamaican man, that they would stay as tenants on the first floor if they could have the exclusive rights to the backyard. And he's like, yeah, sure. So the police, after finding these four bodies, decide, all right, well, several days later, they decide we're going to go look in this backyard and search it, see what we can find. So they find this old, broken down trellis that is being propped up by a femur bone. That's one of the largest bones in the body. It's in your leg. And they surmise that that bone was probably propping that trellis up during the search of that property after the death of Geraldine and Beryl Evans. But it was missed. So they find this and they start, okay, we're going to excavate this backyard. So they excavate it and they're finding all of these human remains, skeletal remains. Yeah. Some were charred, some weren't, some weren't. So those are sent over to the medical examiner, and he concludes after, you know, probably piecing everything together. They actually like lay out all the bones and, you know, parts where they go, and they decide some things are missing, but there are two bodies that you found in that backyard. Now, while they were searching this backyard, they also found the driver's license of a man by the name of Alexander Becker. So they find Alexander and they're like, we got your driver's license. And he's like, yeah, I lived there for 3 days with John Christie. He says, my my girlfriend at the time, Hectorina McKinnon, we, she was kind of transient and so was I. We didn't have jobs and we met each other. We fell in love. We wanted to find a place to live. So Hectorina had met John Christie at a cafe and he said he had a room to rent her. So when she shows up at John Christie's house, she's got Alexander in tow. And John Christie's not real happy about that because he thought he was just renting the room to Hectorina. So Hectorina and Alexander proceed to move into this room. And 3 days later, John Christie says, it's not working out. You guys have to leave. So they leave. And then they go to this unemployment place, basically. He's looking for employment. And he says, I'm going to go in, see what they have. You wait outside. So she's waiting outside. When he comes back outside, Alexander comes back out. Hectorina says, John Christie just came up to me and said he wanted me to come back to the flat for some reason. She says, I'm going to go back there, see what he wants, and I'll meet you at the cafe later. And so Alexander sits at this cafe till like 5 p.m. She never shows up. So he figures, okay, I don't know what happened to her, but let me go see if she's still at John Christie's house. So he goes over to John Christie's flat and he says, no, I haven't seen her. She didn't show up here, but I'll help you look for her. So he helps Alexander look for her. They can't find her. He goes so far as to later that week, John Christie shows up where this guy found a job and says, did you find her yet? And he's like, no. So Alexander doesn't report her missing because when he met her, she was very transient. And he figured, oh, she just decided she didn't want to be with me anymore and she left me. But Hectorina's brothers reported her missing, and this is how the police had her fingerprints from an item they must have given the police to help locate her. So that's how they identified her as the first victim in that kitchen discovered by that construction worker. So fingerprints also led to the identity of the other two young women's bodies that were found in the cupboard. One was Rita Wilson. I'm sorry, Rita Nelson. Rita Nelson. Is it Wilson? I can't read my own writing. Rita Nelson. She was in and out of jail for minor offenses. So they had her fingerprints, probably a sex worker of some type. And they were able to identify her as the second victim. It's not known how she met up with John Christie. They were able to do the same thing with the third victim, also a sex worker. Her name was Kathleen Maloney. She was 26 years old. She was reported missing by her friend Maureen, who said that she and Kathleen met John Christie at an establishment, and he said he was a photographer and he offered to photograph us, and he said he would pay us. So he said, I got a place where we can do it. So he takes them to his flat, and they get naked and he takes pictures of them, and then he gets naked and they take pictures of him, and then he pays them and they go on their way. No sex. But they meet up with him a few nights later, where John Christie and Kathleen become intoxicated and leave together, and she is never seen again. And her fingerprints did identify her as that third victim in the kitchen. So, meanwhile, who is this John Christie? So, John Christie, growing up, he was the child that always gets bullied growing up. So, at 17 years old, he decides, I'm going to join the military. So, he joins the military, participates in World War I as an infantryman. While he's in France, he suffers a gas injury that he claims left him blind for 6 months and unable to speak for 3.5 months. But no one could ever find any medical records or documents to support that claim. He married his wife Ethel in 1920, and after that, he was in and out of prison for petty larceny, grand larceny, stole a car, assaulted somebody. So he spent various times in prison. When he gets out, Ethel would always take him back. And by 1938, they decided they wanted to move into this 3-story home in the first floor flat. That was in 1938. Prior to that, they had tried to have children. She was unsuccessful. She had a miscarriage, so they didn't have any kids with them. But he became what they call a war reserve constable, which means he was a police officer, because several of the police officers were now participating in World War II. So in 1943, he resigns his position as war constable. And they said that while he had this position, he was very, very strict, um, very mean to people, very military. He wasn't like the nice police officer guy. So he stops doing that in 1943 and gets a job at a transistor radio factory. So December of 1952 is the last time anybody saw his wife, Ethel Christie. Now, Ethel and he had both testified, earlier in 1950 against Timothy Evans, but by December of 1952, after that, no one had seen Ethel. So they discover also that she is the fourth victim found under the floorboards in the living room. So where's John Christie? So they put out a bulletin looking for him. We need to find this guy. He's 55 years old, 5'9", dark hair, clean shaven, wearing glasses. To me, that's kind of nondescript, but they put out a sketch of what he would look like, and they had various sightings of him. But one night he appeared on this bridge. It was called the Putney Bridge in London. A police officer saw him there and approached him and said he looked like he was a guy that was kind of down on his luck, wearing a hat and jackets and scarf. And so he approached the guy and he said, what's going on? And he's like, oh, I'm unemployed. Can't get a job because I don't have an employment card yet. And the guy says, take off your hat. And he takes his hat off and he goes, oh, John Christie, you're under arrest. So he arrests him and takes him down to the police station, where he is interrogated, and he confesses to his wife's murder. He claims that she didn't like all these Jamaican people moving into the flat, and it got on her nerves. And one night he found her up in her bedroom having seizures, and he felt like she was beyond any medical treatment, so he strangled her to death to put her out of her misery. He then goes on to confess to the other three murders, claiming self-defense in various forms for each particular victim. For example, one victim, he said, assaulted him, and during the assault, her clothes got tangled around her neck, and she choked to death. And then the other one, he said, she tried to hit me with a frying pan, so I strangled her to death. He referred to each of those murders as regrettable. He also admitted to this device where he would that he made out of a rubber hose, where he'd hook it up to the gas and he would administer this carbon monoxide to the victims. They would go unconscious. He would sexually assault, strangle them, and then bury them or put them in the cupboard. He would actually boast about his crimes to other inmates where he was staying in jail pending his trial. He was examined by several psychiatrists, some on behalf of the prosecution, some on the behalf of the defense. Even though he had confessed to all these murders, he pled not guilty by reason of insanity. And it's thought that his attorneys believed that the more he confessed to, uh, the more he would look insane. Now, remember, at the time, you could only try people for one murder. If they'd committed four other murders, he was charged with four murders, they had to pick just one to try, and then they could bring in evidence of the other three murders into that trial. So they picked Ethel, his wife. They had the most evidence regarding her, so they picked Ethel to be the victim that they would try him for murder for. He was never charged with the two women in the backyard. So who were these two women in the backyard? John confessed that these two women had been murdered 6 years before the murder of Beryl and Geraldine Evans in 1950. So 1940, I can't do math. 1944? Anyway. He said one was named Rebecca First, and she was a student nurse who did part-time sex work to supplement her income, who happened to fall madly in love with John Christie. So when John's wife, Ethel, was out of town visiting relatives, he had her over. He had sex with her, and he strangled and murdered her and hid her in the backyard. The other person in the backyard they determined to be 32-year-old Beryl Edie, who was one of his co-workers at the transistor radio factory. She had confided in him that she had this really severe bronchitis and she just couldn't shake it. So he says, I've studied medicine. Why don't you come over and I will help you. I can help you with that. And so she goes over to his house. He administers the gas to help her with the bronchitis. She goes unconscious. He sexually assaults her and strangles her and buries her in the backyard. Yeah. So meanwhile, the prosecution and the defense hire psychiatrists to examine John Christie to see if he really is insane. Some say he was, some say he wasn't. But what he liked to do was talk. And he would say some outlandish statement towards the end of his sessions with these psychiatrists so that he could stay there and keep on talking. So at the end of one of his sessions, he confesses to the murder of Beryl Evans. He says, we know from part one that Beryl was pregnant. She was 16 weeks pregnant, and she did not want anything to do with that second pregnancy. She had gone through the pregnancy the first time with Geraldine. They had difficulty making ends meet. She had to get a job. If she went through with this pregnancy, she'd have to quit her job and they'd be struggling for money again, and they had to pay for their furniture, and it goes on and on. So she didn't want this child. And Timothy Evans, who was convicted of her murder, said, of course, you've got one child. What's another? So John Christie knew that she wanted an abortion because she had confided in John's wife, Ethel, that she wanted an abortion. So John said he goes up to her one day after Timothy goes to work. He goes to her apartment, and Beryl had told Timothy, if I can't get rid of it, because she was trying all the different ways to abort this child on her own because abortions were illegal. So she says, if I can't abort this child, I'm going to kill myself. So John goes up to see her that after Timothy goes to work one day, and she's trying to commit, take her own life, by administering gas to herself. So he says, hey, let me help you. So he helps her kill herself. So when she goes unconscious from the gas, he sexually assaults her, strangles her. Then when Timothy comes home, and this is very consistent with the evidence and the second story, because we know Timothy's told several lies to the police. But during his second story, when he said, John Christie murdered my wife and child, it wasn't me. He said that when he came home, John Christie approached him at the front door. And this is what John Christie is saying during his confession. I waited till Timothy got home. I approached him. I told him that it didn't go well. I had tried to perform the abortion. And so he walked upstairs to find his wife deceased in the bed. And then John Christie, whose IQ was much higher than Timothy Evans's IQ, convinces Timothy Evans, hey, they always look at the husband. They're going to be looking at you for the murder of your wife. Help me get rid of the body. So the two of them take the body and put it on the second story of the flat because there was nobody living there at the time. It was rented, but nobody was living there. And then that night, or later after Timothy's not in the picture, John takes her and stores her in the backyard. Now, John never confesses how the murder of Geraldine occurred. So we don't know, but he's confessed to those murders. Now, some people believed him, some people didn't. His defense attorney said, the psychiatrist said he found him very credible. He found the whole story about Beryl's death or murder very, very credible, and did believe that he had committed this murder. But the prosecution was saying, "Oh, you're just using that to because you're pleading insanity. So the more murders you rack up, the more insane you look." So on June 22nd, 1953, John Christie goes on trial for the murder of his wife, Ethel Christie. Now, they had to decide between the four victims which person would try. They chose Ethel because they had the most evidence against her. The trial took 3 days, 3 whole days. And at the end, after 80 minutes of jury deliberation, the jury came back and found him guilty of his wife's murder. Of course, there was evidence brought in about the other murders, and he was sentenced to the mandatory sentence for murder, which was death. He received the death penalty. So before he could be executed, he was sent to the same prison where Timothy Evans had been sent. They even put him in the same cell that Timothy Evans had occupied. Then, after his appeal failed, the executioner, the one that executed Timothy Evans, comes to get John Christie and executes him. Same way he's hung. However, John Christie is the last serial killer to be murdered or to receive the death penalty in the UK. After that, Parliament abolished the death penalty and put into place a mandatory life sentence for murderers. Now, after this conviction, there was a lot of debate in the community, a lot of debate about, did Timothy Evans really kill his wife and child? Did he not kill his wife and child? They put together an inquest, and during this private inquest, the person that completed the inquest was given 1 week to look at all the evidence from Timothy's trial, look at all the evidence from John Christie's trial, and make a decision. Well, he came to the decision that these were separate murders. So what is the likelihood that you've got two murderers in the same house and they both commit murder by strangulation? But he said, no, they're separate. So nobody believed it. Nobody said, no, it can't be. It just can't be. So there were a lot of high profile people and many people in Parliament that believed in the innocence of Timothy Evans. Several books were written on the topic, and the death penalty, I said before, was abolished. That was in 1965. And in 1966, Timothy Evans' sisters petitioned the crown for a pardon, and Queen Elizabeth gave Timothy Evans a full pardon, posthumously, obviously, for the murder of his wife and child. There was a second inquiry. They did convene a second inquiry at some point, and the conclusion of that inquiry was, again, there was no change in whether Timothy murdered his wife and child or not, because the person doing the inquiry says they were both liars. We don't know. And to this day, it's still debated. Did Timothy Evans really murder his wife and child, or was it John Christie? So, love to hear what you think in the comments. I hope you enjoyed this story out of the UK. I'm sure if you're from the UK, you'll correct me if I got some of this wrong. I appreciate you listening. Probably the most well-read book on this case is called 10 Rellington Place. So if you want to look it up and read the book, you can. But I'm going to have a nice Thanksgiving, and I hope you do too. I'll see you on Monday for Crafting and Crime Daily. Bye, everybody.